Hi guys. As you can maybe tell from the picture-in-picture, the fanciness that's going on here, I'm trying out a new recording software. Hopefully it works out and this is good and works nicely. So this is now the second lecture, or third if you count that little 10-minute here's what it says on the syllabus lecture that I have kind of put out. In the last lecture, we talked, or I talked, I guess, a lot about the meaning of history, what it means to do history, what history kind of is, and how it works in both our society in general and on kind of an individual or kind of an internal level for a lot of people. This course, or sorry, this lecture, I want to kind of do something with that framework, right? I want to start using that framework to talk about the Middle Ages and the Middle Ages in a particular time, which is to say the the age of white supremacy, as it were. We'll talk a little bit about what that means too. This is still going to be a little bit meta, because I really wanted what I wanted to start doing for the next three lectures is to give you a history of the Middle Ages, as it were. As I said, it's going to be over the next three lectures, and I want to cover a period in those three lectures from about 1450 or so up to about 1950 or so. For this first one, however, I'm going to focus on the period from between about 1450 to about 1800, what's usually called early modernity. And kind of how the idea of a Middle Age, as it were, or a medieval period, developed in the early modern period. Because first things first, right? There are no there is no such thing, kind of objectively speaking, as the Middle Ages. There is no grand announcement in 476 when Rome falls. No one comes down from the clouds and goes, "Yes, you are all medieval now." And no one comes down in 1500 and goes, "Yes, you are now all early modern," right? This is not. These divisions in time are artificial, right? They're not following. We can explain them with events, and we can say, well, this event to this event, and that like kind of makes sense to think about, but they're not. They have no objective existence, right? And those who lived during the Middle Ages would not have understood the term. They would not have called themselves medieval people. Of course not. They would have called themselves modern people. They did call themselves modern people. And so the medieval period, and specifically, and kind of, I really want to emphasize the division between the medieval period and the modern period, which is about 1500, is an artificial delineation in time created by humans and for human purposes. The fancy word for this kind of chunking out of time is called periodization, right? The creation of periods. And the division between, particularly between the medieval and the modern, is very, very, very strong in popular imagination. What is medieval is very kind of strong, and what is modern, the fact they don't mix, is very modern, is kind of a very important part of modern imagination. And it's also actually very important in the ways in which the modern academy, in which the university system is organized. There is a stark division between, particularly in history departments, between modern and pre-modern professors. There's a lot of modern professors and not a lot of pre-modern professors. It's a general principle. And often, in academic works, you won't see people who bridge kind of the 15th to the 16th century. It just kind of doesn't happen. And we kind of want to emphasize here that because these periods, right, the creation of the medieval period is an artificial delineation time and created by humans, and for the emphasis on for human purposes, right? And so the periodization that we're talking about here is not merely a convenience, right? It's not like, oh, well, if I didn't chunk out time as 500 to 1500, if I didn't call that the medieval period, then I would just have to write a book about everything. No, you wouldn't, right? The these are kind of these periods of time are bound up within structures, discourse and structures of power and authority, which govern the society and culture of the time in which they are occurring, right? Which is to say things like capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. These periodizations are bound up and part of the construction of all these things. So for the next few lectures, let's talk about how people came to create this particular artificial division of time we call the medieval period, and why it has so much power. But first, let's kind of get a clear picture about what we're talking about, because there was a little bit of a flurry in academic circles a couple years ago when the AP test kind of removed everything before 1492, and therefore no one was going to teach it in high school history anymore. So I have gotten students particularly over the past 5 years, with a very kind of variable level of knowledge of pre-modern history. So I'm just going to kind of, and there's no prerequisite for this course. Of course, you don't have to take a course on the Middle Ages before you take this course with me. So I just kind of want to lay out what we're talking about before we get into why it exists, right? So, picture. Let's see if I can. Yeah, we could do that. Okay. So the medieval period, as traditionally defined within the bounds of what we would call Western Europe, which kind of terminates with the border of what is now Germany-ish, and goes all the way into the British Isles and Ireland, and probably not further north than about Denmark, for what we're talking about, and not, of course, across the Mediterranean. The usual definition of the medieval period is 500 to 1500 of the Common Era. And I would note, just by the way, this is the medieval period or the Middle Ages. Medieval Times is a restaurant where you can watch a joust and eat a chicken leg. I think there's like one in Toronto and a couple in other places around the US. Medieval Times is not a term that we will be using in this course. Unless you want to do a project examining medieval times, which would be interesting. I would very much like to see that. In any case, these two dates, 500 and 1500, traditionally come from, at the beginning, the fall of the Roman Empire. And by the fall of the Roman Empire, what we actually mean is the fall of the Western Roman Empire, because of course the Roman Empire had been divided into East and Western halves since the 3rd century, and the kind of the fall of the Western Empire, which is usually dated to, again, 476, is the death or abdication, I can't remember which, of the last Roman emperor in Rome. Right, there is still a Roman emperor in Constantinople, which is probably the more powerful of the two for the last kind of half of the Roman imperial period, which we usually would call the Byzantine emperor at this point in time, but they would have called themselves the Roman emperor over in Constantinople. And that empire lasted until 1453. So when we say the fall of the Roman Empire, what we mean is the fall of the Roman Empire that's important to Western Europe, right? And this is also a period which the empire supposedly falls because of a bunch of invasions by barbarian tribes from the north or the west. This has been roundly kind of rebuked by scholars. The idea of barbarian and Roman are not nearly as strict as we think, but it's important, kind of the reason why this is kind of a division period, the reason why 500 kind of sticks, is because a lot of modern cultural and ethnic identities trace themselves back, and have done since about, this period that we're going to be talking about, the early modern period, to these barbarians, supposedly peoples who come into or invade Rome, the most commonly and well known of which is the Franks. The Frankish tribe comes and takes over what is now roughly France, Germany, and the Low Countries in about 490. The Clovis is the king of the Franks. And then you have the Franks, of course, become the French, right? The later date, the 1500 date, this one has a couple more reasons given as explanations, but there's a development. The more recent explanations have said that 1500 makes sense because it's, well, first of all, it's the fall of the Byzantine Emperor, which is the end of the Roman Empire, right? Well, unless you're Russian or Turkish, in which case you think the Roman Empire ended in 1917 or 1921, or if you're Russian, actually, maybe it still hasn't ended. Maybe Vladimir Putin is currently the head of the Roman Empire. And also things like the printing press, right, which is invented in the 1450s. Like, that kind of makes sense. A slightly older kind of justification for 1500 is that Columbus discovers the New World in 1492, right? And by discovers the New World, as we talked about in last class, what we really mean is that he let Europeans, and Western Europeans specifically, know about it. It was, well, people knew about it, just not in Europe before then. But kind of the oldest and most powerful and longest lasting, for reasons we'll discuss, reason for that 1500 division is the Protestant Reformation, which is usually, the beginning of which is usually defined as 1517, when Martin Luther goes and nails 95 theses to the doors of Wittenberg Cathedral in order to spark a debate, and ends up creating his own branch of Christianity. This 1415 is actually kind of a later date. There's things that look like the Protestant Reformation, but are not nearly as successful. Starting in the late 14th century, called Lollardism and Hussitism, are two things that kind of prefigure Martin Luther. But in any case, for reasons we'll discuss, 1500 is very important as a breaking point in the Protestant Reformation. And as I said, these are, the places which are traditionally given, these are the dates that are traditionally given to delineate the medieval period. But there are other options. As I said, 1917 or 1921 are also kind of perfectly valid ideas of when the Roman Empire ends, and therefore when the medieval period ends, perhaps. You might also say that something like 1215, which is the death of Pope Innocent III, who is probably the most powerful pope who has ever lived, kind of marks the high water mark of the power of the Roman papacy. You may say that that's kind of the end of the medieval period, and we can call the medieval period 600 to 1200, which is the popes trying to take over control of Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Right? That's a kind of a periodization that makes sense, right? And I will actually present you an argument in the last of these three kind of subset of lectures that the Middle Ages ended at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, in the First World War. However you want to splice it, this broader period, the medieval period, is usually divided into 3 to 4 subcategories, which you have seen on your screen this entire time. The first of which is this period from about 300 to 700 CE, which is called Late Antiquity. This is the most recent kind of division of time out of the Middle Ages. It only comes from about the 1970s and is really the work of a scholar named Peter Brown, who's quite smart, that man. This kind of period, this 300 to 700 kind of contains the decline of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of the Eastern as kind of the more powerful half. It also kind of contains the initial spread of Christianity throughout the empire. and the consolidation of a kind of a Catholic faith, of a standard set of religious doctrines. Again, and these ones are called heresy, and these ones are called Catholic, which means Orthodox. It's the same thing. Catholic means Orthodox. So the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church are actually the same. It's the same word for two different words for the same concept. At the same time, we have the formation of the Christian canon. This is when the Vulgate, or the Jeromine translation of the Latin Bible, which is the one that is used up until 1600 throughout most of Europe, is written, and by Jerome, as the Jeromine Bible would suggest. This is also the period of barbarian invasions, which I mentioned briefly before. This period of late antiquity overlaps a bit with an older period, an older idea, which is that of the early Middle Ages, which is about 500 to 600 to 900 of the Common Era. This period has alternately been viewed as a period of decline, darkness, and stagnation, or more recently, the origins of things to come. One recent book has been titled The Long Mourning of Medieval Europe. If there is a dark age, and I don't like that term for a lot of reasons, and we can discuss that in both section and kind of subsequent lectures. If there is a dark age, and by a dark age I mean a period which we cannot see because we do not have sources to describe that period to us, not because the people in it were particularly stupid or backwards. But there is a dark age. It's the 7th century. We have very few. I think we have 2 texts that describe the last 50 years of the 7th century, 650 to 700. So this is kind of that period that we're talking about. And by the way, we don't have many texts for that period, not because they weren't written, but because later kind of kingdoms deliberately destroyed them. It's a period also of political reorganization. We see the decline, of course, Roman imperial power, and the organization of the various kingdoms in the Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in what is now France and Germany, the Angles and the Saxons in what is now the British Isles, and the Lombards in Italy, northern Italy specifically. It's also a period of economic decline. There is definitely, in part due to the fact that the southern part of the Mediterranean is now Muslim, there is a massive decrease in shipping across the Mediterranean basin, which was the lifeblood of the Roman Empire, and therefore there is an economic decline over this period. There's also a population decline. I think the population of Rome shrinks from something. It was like something from it's at least 1/4 of its original size. This is also when we see the rise of what has been called the Holy Roman Empire, which you get a nice description of the relationship of the Holy Roman Empire to the Roman Empire on the slide behind me, which is, in the words of Voltaire, the 18th century French satirist, a triple negative or a triple lie, because it is neither holy nor Roman nor empire. Which is where you have people like Charlemagne, if you've heard that name, who is perhaps the first Holy Roman Emperor. In some people's minds, some say it's slightly later. This is academic discussion that doesn't super matter for our points. And this is also the period where you see Viking invasions. If you've seen the TV show Vikings, this is when it's happening in the 9th century. Following the following the early Middle Ages, we have the Central or High Middle Ages. Those are kind of 2 alternate terms. Most people say high, but kind of Central has becoming more and more popular because it doesn't have sort of a kind of a golden age bias to it, as it were. And this is a period of more political reorganization. The power of the Holy Roman Empire in this period kind of fragments, a bit. And there is a significant reorganization around more local power centers. This is when we really see the development of what have been called feudal structures, although that term is a problem for a bunch of different reasons. This is also the period where we see crusades, which is really Europe's first adventure into colonialism. The creation of stone castles. There were no stone castles before the Crusades. in Europe. So building in stone is something that starts happening again here. This is also what has been called the period of the formation of a persecuting society. This period sees a massive rise in the interest in regulating the similarity, homogeneity of belief, homogeneity of thought, homogeneity of sexual practices, and homogeneity of gender roles, right? And persecuting people who deviate from those social norms. One argument has, for example, shown that until this period, the Catholic Church really didn't care who you were having, what kind of gender you were having sex with. Like, they had rules. They said, you can't have sex with men, but they didn't really persecute anyone for it. Or men can't have sex with men, but they didn't really persecute anyone for it. And if they did, they'd have to get rid of a lot of monasteries. That's just... There's also a period of increasing bureaucracy and an increasing kind of acceptance of kind of written or contract language as kind of binding and valid from like this abstract concept called law, and you have to obey it, versus this guy has an army and you have to obey what he says. And we call this kind of a transition from memory to written record, is the kind of general term for this. It's also a period of popular religious fervor. There's a widespread desire to engage in Catholic religion or Christian religion, of which the Crusades is a prominent expression. But also, this is the origins of many religious orders, which continue unto the present day, such as the Dominicans and Franciscans. The Dominicans are the ones who run Providence College, by the way. And as I said before, papal power is kind of at its height in this period. It's the triumph of the Church over the Holy Roman Empire and over kind of individual kingdoms, and establishing itself as kind of the authority over all of Europe. And finally, it's the period which sees the formation of universities. A universitas is simply the Latin word for a corporation, a corporate body of people. And universities came into being at Paris and Bologna almost simultaneously. They still fight over who was first. But at Paris, it was a bunch of teachers came together to set prices for their students. And at Bologna, it was a bunch of students came to set prices for what they were willing to pay for lectures from their teachers. It's also a period where kind of the university structure kind of aided and abetted by the rediscovery of Greek thought, which means the reintroduction of Greek thought into the West, into the Latin West, mainly from Hebrew and Arabic sources, which were preserved in Spain, or in the Iberian Peninsula. And finally, after this kind of period, we have what appeared from 1200 to 1500, which is called the Late Middle Ages. And if the early Middle Ages, the Central or High Middle Ages, is usually the setting, the kind of the historical backdrop, the events, or the kind of the scenery for many of the works we have of that depict the Middle Ages, from film and television to books and plays and things like that. If that's kind of the central, they almost always take the Central or High Middle Ages as their point of when they want to talk about. They always take the costuming, the people's dress and the armor and things like that comes almost entirely from the later Middle Ages, which is kind of strange until you think about the fact that, well, actually the later Middle Ages are kind of the earliest period from which we still have fabric and metal that survive, or fabric and metal armor that survive, because armor in battle and it rusts, like it's high carbon steel, it's gonna rust very quickly. So most of the exempla, like Hollywood props departments have, the earliest ones they have are from the late Middle Ages. This is a period which sees kind of, as I said a little bit earlier, kind of the first kind of factionalism within the Catholic Church. There's things that look like proto-Protestantism kind of developing here. Plate armor, as I said, is from this period. Very, very late, actually. The kind of the knight in shining armor image is almost early modern. You would see much more of that from the 16th century than you would in the 14th. Chivalric culture is at its peak here, kind of court culture, lay vernacular poetry, particularly in French poetry, Middle French poetry. Consolidation of kingdoms. You have kind of these more local kind of people gathered around their baron or their count, starting to, and those counts kind of starting to be pulled more directly into the orbit of a king. And therefore, there's a growing local identification as being part of a kingdom rather than simply part of your local, local city or town or countryside. It's also, however, a period of decline. One guy named Johannes Huizinga has called it the autumn of the Middle Ages. Papal fiscalism, which is to say the papacy has a massive need for a lot of reasons for money in this period. And so they start finding all these different sorts of ways to tax people and get money from people. This is really a problem that ends up causing the Protestant Reformation. Although the kind of the degree to which it has been kind of overemphasized by the fact that the Protestants hated it so much and have controlled a lot of what has been said since. It's also the period which we see the first witch trials, right? And this kind of really solidification of persecution, particularly of gender roles in this period. They very much ossify over this period. And things like the ossification also of kind of class roles. There's a lot more class mobility, and things that we would, again, call feudal structures are a lot more loose and fluid before kind of the 15th century. The kind of the first explosion of thought at the universities starts to also kind of coagulate a bit. If you've ever heard academics accused of counting the number of angels dancing on the head of a pin, this is the period in which they actually tried to do that. Like, that was a question: how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? And no one cares. And so you see a lot of esoteric kind of discussions. The word dunce comes from a follower of a guy named Duns Scotus, who's a guy who's at Oxford in this period. But it's also a period of something we would recognize as science in a lot of different ways. There's interest in what's going on in the heavens. There's interest in, what the stars are doing, things like that. There's the creation of automata, like what we would call early kind of mechanical or clockwork robots. And this is also the period which is commonly called the Renaissance, although the Renaissance happens at different times in different places. The Italian Renaissance is mostly the 14th century. The French kind of get it in the 15th century, and the English in the 16th century, because kind of England is a backwater until the colonial period. And so that's kind of that's what we're talking about. Those are the events and kind of general structures of what we're talking about. And as we discussed last time, the individual events and themes, which I have just kind of gone over there, certainly happened, right? Plate armor was invented. Papal power grew. Right? But our decision to group those in the wrapper of something that we would call the medieval period, or even the early Middle Ages or the late Middle Ages, is a subjective decision, right? Those facts which are true have this subjective wrapper to them. And so what I want to do for the second part of, or the rest of kind of this lecture, is to examine the history of that subjective wrapper. There is the first kind of hint of something that resembles our idea of the Middle Ages comes from the Italians in the Renaissance, who have traditionally been called humanists because they prize human thought over kind of questions of religion, although that's kind of an artificial distinction that makes more sense to us than it would to them. These humanists viewed Rome's height, which they thought was the late Republic or early Empire, roughly 100 years on either side of the birth of Christ, so 100 BC to 100 AD or CE, as your preferences may be. as a golden age. Like this period of Rome, this late Republican period of Rome, was a golden age from which humanity had fallen, and which they were trying to grasp the last vestiges of light that had fallen from there. And this is the first idea of a dark age comes here, right? This is a dark age that intercedes between what would be the present of the Renaissance humanists and the glories of the Roman past. And so for these humanists, there is a point of historical rupture. This point of historical rupture, however, was not as it is now at approximately 1500, but for them, the fall of Rome, or the end of the Western Roman Empire at the end of the 5th century. And they were in a middle period between Rome's glory and kind of the end of the world, right? They were in a period of decline and stagnation. And we want to kind of contrast that structure to today, where the point of rupture is, again, 1500, and things have improved since then. So we have a similar idea, but working kind of in its opposite, right? For the humanists, the point of rupture was was in the past, and it was a period of decline since that point of rupture. And for us, the point of rupture is almost, is relatively recent, and is a point of growth since that rupture. So what causes this shift in perception, right? What turns people around from this distant point in the past to a more recent one, and a narrative of decline to a narrative of progress? Well, I want to kind of put my finger on two things. There's, of course, infinite number of things, but two of them I want to distinguish here. One is the Protestant Reformations, which have kind of been a bugbear throughout this lecture, and the other is the anti-monarchical, against the king, the revolutions against the kings of France and England. First, the Protestant Reformations, right? And for, again, those of you who have not had this extensively covered in previous history courses, these are the revolt of various public figures, Martin Luther, who I have already mentioned, but there's a bunch of others, against the breaking with the idea that the Catholic Church, and specifically the Pope, had the authority to, or was correct on certain issues of theology. This is not the first time this has happened in the Catholic Church's history. Ever since really the beginning of Christianity, there have been heretics. Heresis is a Greek word that means choice, and first occurs in the 2nd century CE. So pretty much from when we have the first Christian writings, we have heretics. And the implication there, of course, is it's a bad choice. The most famous of these heretic groups before have been what is called the Arians. That's Aryan with an I, as opposed to the racial category that Hitler loved so much, which is Aryan with a Y. And these Arians with an I simply believe that Christ was fully human and not divine, whereas the Catholic Church teaches that, and has taught since about the 7th century, that Christ is both fully divine and fully human, and that is formally classified as a mystery. It's not supposed to make sense. And so this is not the first time the Catholic Church had to kind of grapple with people who disagreed with it on theology. But this is the first time that the church has been unable to bring those dissenters under its control, either through violent suppression or kind of a negotiated reintegration. It uses both tactics it has used both tactics over times at different places to varying degrees of success. And when these figures, including Martin Luther among them, try to break away from kind of Catholic theology, what they're really breaking away from is kind of contemporary Catholic theology for them. So the stuff that's important the way that the Catholic Church sees the world at about the year 1500. And when they do this, they look to the period, the more recent period, the last 300 years or so, that is to say what we would now call the late Middle Ages, as a period of decline and corruption and failed reform, which in many ways it was. But at the same time, these Reformation figures look to the period of the Central or High Middle Ages, that is about 1100, 1200, or late antiquity, 300 to 500-ish, as a period of religious fervor, right? And when they do this, so for example, Martin Luther, who you see on the right here, when he wants to quote someone as an authority, he usually chooses the Holy Bible, of course. And when he doesn't quote from the Holy Bible, he quotes from St. Augustine of Hippo, who is a bishop in North Africa in the 4th and 5th centuries. And when he's not quoting from Augustine of Hippo, he's quoting from a guy named Bernard of Clairvaux, who you see on the left here, who died in the 12th century. He was probably the most powerful individual human in the 12th century who you've never heard of. Also the subject of most of my research. And so what we see here is kind of the same general model as the Italian Renaissance humanists, right? That there's a point of rupture in the past, a period of decline which intercedes between the modern and that point of rupture, and an endeavor to get back to that ideal. And so the Middle Ages, what we would now call the Middle Ages, takes on two functions. It is both a privileged origin of the things that you value, or individual values, and is also the condemned past of the things that they don't like, right? And in terms of kind of religious matters, Protestant polemic becomes increasingly antagonistic towards the medieval church. Just like, Bernard himself might have been a classy guy and everyone likes him, but the institution of the papacy never gets that kind of credit ever again, because it's the main antagonist for the Protestant sects during this early modern period. And this kind of bias against Catholic churchmen is still very kind of present in our memories of the way the medieval period was. There are almost no depictions, positive depictions of medieval churchmen in anything. There are usually cravens or cowards, people who are willing to run away or wheedle, or they're fat and eating too much and starving the peasantry, or they don't believe any of the things that they're preaching and instead are just trying to manipulate people. The two exceptions that I can think of are either the Brother Cadfael, which is a British TV series which has a monk as a Sherlock Holmes kind of a figure doing investigations, or In the Name of the Rose, which is similar with a Franciscan monk kind of doing the same thing. But in both those cases, the main characters are unusual. They're outcasts, they're outsiders, they're more prone to thinking than all of their contemporaries, who are backwards barbarians, religious zealots, that sort of a thing. So the ideas and the biases imparted into an idea of the Catholic Church during the Protestant Reformation still live with us today. But of course, the Catholic Church didn't just let this happen. There's something we would call the Counter-Reformation, which is an attempt to address, in a lot of ways, many of the Protestant concerns. But since it comes almost 30 years or 40 years after Martin Luther kind of nails those 95 Theses to the doors of the cathedral, you already have a generation of Protestants since then, and it's just a bit too late. Right? They've lost too much ground. They consolidate Catholic belief, but they don't really make progress into Protestant belief. And so this is these sorts of things happen. About 1555 is the Council of Trent, which is kind of the height of the Counter-Reformation. But again, Trent does kind of a similar thing. They look to certain parts of the Middle Ages and late antiquity as an ideal to which they wish to return. Thomas Aquinas, who I talked about a little bit last lecture, forms his Summa Theologica, forms the backbone of Catholic theology ever since Trent to the present day. Right, this medieval figure, this 13th century guy, this guy from this idealized kind of height of medieval learning, is still the backbone of Catholic thought. There is a particular, also during this period, kind of as these kind of religious changes are happening, there's efforts towards a systemization and organization and the studying of documents and things that have survived from the Middle Ages. This is particularly kind of emphasized among Catholic monastic houses, right? Catholic monasteries, which were very concerned in this period with preserving and maintaining rights and privileges. A privilege is not simply something that you check, but it is, the word comes, it's privilegium, right? Private law, your own special law. And often a privilege quite literally refers to the physical document granting you that right. And the problem with this is that, okay, so I'm an abbot of a monastery over here in France, and I have a document that says I may fish at this bend in the river as much as I want. And the monastery kind of 5 miles upstream also has a document that says they may fish at that bend in the river as much as they want, and no one else can fish there, and whose document is right? And so in this kind of 16th, 17th, 18th century period, we have the development of methodologies to evaluate medieval documents, specifically by two guys, Jean Mabillon, who you see here, and Johannes Papenbroek, who I have not found a picture of. And they invent things, they kind of systematized studies that we now call diplomatics, which is to say the study of legal documents from the medieval period, paleography, paleo, old, graphos, writing, the study of old writing, and like how do you know that this writing, people wrote like this in this period, and people wrote like that in this period, in that period. In Germany they tended to bring the H down very far. In France they tended to put little forks at the tops of their L's. Things like that you learn in paleography. It's one of my special subjects. I run a little seminar on it I don't know what day it's going to be this year, but if you want to, if you know Latin and you'll want to study old handwriting, let me know. And things like philology. Philology, philo, love, logos, word, the love of words, really the precursor to what we would now call linguistics, although it kind of gets corrupted, it goes in a certain direction in the 19th century, which we'll talk about. And the distinction between the works of people like Mabillon and Papenbroek, who are contemporaries with people like Newton and Hooke, right, great scientists that we think of now, that kind of distinction is artificial. It is more modern, and they would not have understood it, that they would see that Newton and Mabillon's work is fundamentally the same, has the same kind of genesis and impulse behind it as a means of understanding who they are and where they're coming from, right? At the same time, when all these people are kind of trying to get their documents in order, we also see early kind of codifying and collecting endeavors of things that are kind of particular points of pride. Another set of monks, the Bollandists, have been working on a project since 1630-ish. They're still working on it today, called the Acta Sanctorum, which is Latin for the Deeds of Saints. And so this is a hundreds of volume compilation of every single saint's life that they can find in a manuscript from Western Europe. And they've even started one for Greek and Greek manuscripts as well, I think, at this point in time. But, this is the beginning of this kind of a thing, of collections of editions of texts to preserve and disseminate so people can study and learn as history, particularly of medieval history. All right, so if that's the religious aspect, then we also have kind of the other side of the lay side of things, the secular side of things, which is to say revolutions against the monarchies in England and France, and particularly in France against the nobility in general. In England, they decapitated King Charles I in 1649 and established a parliamentary form of government, right? There had always been there had been an English parliament for a long time, but it was the only authority in England after from 1649 until they kind of put Charles II back on the throne and were like, well, we want to have a king too again. But the thinkers before this kind of decapitation and after, kind of who supported the parliamentary primacy, kind of had to come up with a reason for it, because everyone up till that point had had lords and kings, and they had to justify a government without royalty. And in so doing, the discussions that they had kind of back and forth over how to do this set the terms for what we now think of as, quote, feudal systems of government, as a justification for kingship as a barbaric but necessary form of government which occurred in the past and which they needed to move beyond, and to which the parliamentary system was superior. Right? And in so doing, they made a lot of, we might call it mistakes at this point in time, but really it's not. It's just that this is the way they were thinking about things. But to call all the things they called feudal is kind of like today saying that, well, America and the Democratic Republic of Congo and the People's Republic of Korea and the People's Republic of China all call themselves republics, and therefore they're all the same form of government. Which is to say, we don't really like the word feudal anymore, because it doesn't really mean anything. And since kind of these systems, these feudal systems that they wanted to talk about, really occurs between 800 and 1500. The Middle Ages became, for these thinkers, a past to progress away from, right? France had a stronger. This is the right slide. France had a stronger absolute monarchy than England. There was no the parliamentary kind of and the factionalism never really got as much of a hold there. And its revolutionaries in the 18th century, a century after the English, were much more anti-noble in general and not just anti-monarchic. And so you see there a lot of myths about the rights, the things that the excesses and corruptions of the nobility kind of are created during these periods as a means to discredit the current nobility as the product of a barbaric medieval past. And the reason why there's a picture of noted anti-Semite Mel Gibson on the screen behind me is that in the movie Braveheart, which he got to use a very bad Scottish accent to shout freedom very loudly. He kind of the thing that starts the whole story going, right, is that the local English lord asserts his right to droit de couchage, right, the right of the lord's first night, which is to say that the local lord has the right to sleep with any of his peasants' wives on their marriage night. He gets first dibs, as it were, and everyone else gets sloppy seconds. This is entirely a myth. This is fabrication created by anti-noble factions within France in the 18th century, right? But again, the medieval past is something they are trying to progress away from, right? The division line is kind of firmly fixed at that point of the Protestant Reformation now, and we're trying to move beyond it and trying to get better. And there's still, even though they're trying to move beyond this medieval period, they still look back to the medieval period as a point to find figures like William Wallace, who's the role Mel Gibson is playing, who they thought were free from feudal oppression, or who fought against feudal oppression. And indeed, discussions of feudalism were deeply tied to discussions over slavery. That is to say, feudal/slave, to contrast with modern/free. And so you have an interesting kind of obsession with slavery as being something that doesn't belong in modernity, right? And doesn't belong in Europe. There's a line, if does anyone know, if you know the song Rule Britannia, which is which is the kind of the theme song, as it were, of the British Navy, is kind of composed and set to music in 1740 and contains a refrain which includes the words, "Britons never will be slaves." In 1740, at the very moment the British Empire, with the Navy as its crown jewel, was transporting kidnapped Africans en masse into slavery in the Americas. The colonial slave trade, in fact, explodes at the very time the public discourse groups kind of feudal and medieval and slavery all together. And so if modern equals free and feudal equals medieval, medieval equals slave, the places with slaves and the slaves themselves must therefore be medieval, backwards in time. Right? So the Americas, although they are the Americas are primitive, they are medieval, and the people in them are doing medieval practices, while Europe is modern and contemporary. And so this, in a sense, this is what we call the denial of coevalness, right? Which I mentioned last class. As one scholar put it, at this point, at the same time, that was too far ahead. At the same time, this is the beginning of kind of imagining time along racialized lines. And yes, time is a racial, kind of has racial components to it. Because if black people are currently slaves and in kind of a medieval structure, that must mean that there weren't any during the Middle Ages, right? To be black is to be other to the Middle Ages, but not the idea of medieval, right? If that is a distinction that makes sense. And so in the 18th century, the medieval period begins to be a time that is imagined as before racial diversity, right? The idea that Europe was a white space before Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, right? And this is kind of a thing that's going to have a legacy for a long, long time. So conclusions. I began by saying that this was a history of a history, right? But another word that can describe what I've been talking about, and I've used a couple times, in fact, is that of memory. And memory, because memory is like, it's tricky, it's unreliable. A history is fact, it's set in stone in some senses. And an individual's memory can often change to match that of the group's. One of the greatest quotes kind of about this that I've ever encountered is one by the English author Thomas Hardy, who says that, quote, "I do not remember it so clearly after all. History remembers it, and I remember it as history." Right? So what he's saying there is that, his memory of the events is hazy, but he knows what everyone else thinks, so he's kind of thinks about it along the same lines. And this happens quite often, right? This is why why we want to study media and depictions of the Middle Ages in this class, because they form this collective memory. And so what I've been talking about in this lecture and has been the collective European memory of the European past, kind of the memories of the things that they liked and the memories of things that were bad, right? But when we think of that, likes and dislikes, we kind of have to remember that therefore, memory, as opposed to history, memory places past events in a direct relationship to current identity. That is a bad memory or that is a good memory, right? You don't have sort of middle memories. And that is to say, memory places historical events within a hierarchy. And so, as you think about kind of today's lecture and your readings, consider what it means that this course is titled The Memories of the Middle Ages and not The History of the Middle Ages in the age of white supremacy. And kind of bring that as a thought to section. Okay. Remember, please, if you have any questions about anything that I've discussed in this lecture, that you need to, oh, where did that go? That if you have any questions about anything that's been discussed in this lecture, you should send me an email by Thursday at noon so I can get kind of responses to those questions out. The readings for this week, Ivanhoe, Book 1. Ivanhoe is divided into 3 books. I'm just going to assign the first one. It's about 130 pages, which is a little bit of reading. I think it's a lot. It's kind of heavy, but since it's a story, I feel it goes a lot faster than things like academic works and stuff like that. The second is a very short article, which is about how it's an argument that Walter Scott started the Civil War, based on an older piece by Mark Twain, who said much the same. And then a chapter of Devil's Historians. And that's it for now, and I will see you next lecture.